thank y'all for being here. Thank y'all for coming, and so we can have a conversation here today about, quite frankly, the law and how some of our issues are, the issues of the day here are affected by the law, how our attorneys general are able to help us advocate Republican principles and the things that we get involved in the political system for. All of you are here and are in this for a reason, and these folks are here to talk about some of the ways that they're able to have an impact on that. And first up is going to be our former South Carolina Attorney General, Charlie Condon. If you would please, sir, give him a round of applause. Come on up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to thank you what you do on behalf of our party here in South Carolina. We really appreciate our chairman, Drew McKissick. Now, this is a really happy occasion for me because not only am I at my old law firm, I used to be a clerk here many, many years ago, one of the best firms in South Carolina, but I want to thank Michael Maloney for making this venue available. We really appreciate it. You're welcome, cousin. We have here today in Charleston, my hometown, some outstanding public officials. I'm really lucky to have them here. They've traveled a distance, one from the capital, Columbia, but the others from some other terrific capitals all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, and from Little Rock, Arkansas. We have the attorneys generals of South Carolina, Arkansas, and Georgia.
The SEC caucus.
Well said, well said. And their backgrounds, they really need no introduction, but they're just outstanding. Alan Wilson, his main claim to fame is he used to be one of my interns. So he's well qualified.
That's right.
Now, Alan is now in his, third term.
Third term.
And he's just done an outstanding job for all of us here in South Carolina. So we're really glad to have him here to have this very frank discussion about what's going on with the lawless Democrats here who happen to be in Charleston today. We also have here, General Rutledge, Leslie Rutledge, and remarkably, I think this is just such an achievement. She not only is the first Republican elected as Attorney General of Arkansas, but also the first woman. So she really wears a double hat there. Thank you for being here. And Chris Carr, he has established himself as an outstanding attorney general in this country. He was also a vice chairman of the Republican Attorney Generals Association, which I happen to have been the first chairman. So I really appreciate his leadership. And on top of that, he was appointed to his office, but he has now earned it. He's run successfully in Georgia. He's been elected as the Attorney General of South Carolina. So we're really pleased to have him here to also give his viewpoints on these important topics we're about to discuss. So if I can start off, I have the honor of posing the first question. And of course it goes to our local Attorney General, Alan Wilson. And I think this really is up your alley. General, the Democrats have come to South Carolina in complete disarray. The leader of their party is an avowed socialist who doesn't believe in America and wants to take our country in the same failed direction as Cuba, Venezuela, and the old Soviet Union. How do you contrast these candidates to the rule of law administration led by President Trump?
Thank you, General Condon. And if I may, I'd like to take a brief moment before I jump to the answer to that question to welcome many of my friends, supporters, constituents here in Charleston. Thank you for coming today. It is an honor to see all of you, as always. It is great to be up here with you, General Condon, my colleagues, Leslie Rutledge and Chris Carr. And I have to say that I've one of the best jobs, best reasons for being Attorney General is you get to serve with some of the most amazing people. And we have really become the best of friends over the last several years. And it has been an honor to serve with them. And there are some real up-and-coming leaders in this country, and they're all coming from the AG Corps, and I'm honored to have you here. Welcome to South Carolina. I hope you both spend a lot of money here, especially in Charleston. We have some potholes to fill. We need the revenue. Can I get an amen? And one last quick alibi about General Condon. He was the founding member, one of the 4 founding members of the Republican AG Association. There was 4 of you at one time, I believe. Now there's 27. A majority of the AGs in the country are now Republican AGs. So thank you. 3 of us are standing on the shoulders of giants who came before us. So thank you for being here and moderating this. To your question, that you asked, how does this group of national candidates for president for the Democratic nomination compare to the rule of law administration run by President Trump? You know, it's interesting. One of the major attacks that you see oftentimes lobbed at President Trump and this administration and many of its members is that it's tyrannical. They've been called fascists. They've been compared to Nazis. Been called all these horrible names. But what's interesting about these attacks is that, you know, one thing that Nazis and fascists all have in common is they were all run by dictators who tried to consolidate power within their governments, make their governments larger, bigger, more distant from the people, more out of touch from the people, and more powerful than the people. It seems that everything that this president is doing is the exact opposite of what a dictator does, is pushing power away from the federal government, doing everything you can to honor the boundaries set up by separation of powers in our Constitution, as well as the system of federalism that we live under. When our founders and our framers of the Constitution, you know, wrote it 200 plus years ago, they were trying to get away from an empire that was very distant. It had grown too distant. It had grown too powerful. It had grown too invasive. And so they fought a war over this. And instead of living under the Articles of Confederation, they drafted a constitution with one fundamental building block under it, a limiting principle, to give the government enough power to protect its citizens, but not so much power that it can turn them back into subjects, which we had just come out from under in the Revolutionary War. And we have two very different visions right now. We have a vision in which one party wants to limit the role of government in individuals' lives, wants to limit the role of government in the sense that it can't be all things to all people. A government big enough to give you everything that you want is big enough to take everything that you have. And that is why I'm a conservative. That is why I belong to the Republican Party. When you look at the other side, you see people who are, and here's the thing, there are many, many good Democrats, people that we all know, that our friends, our neighbors, we go to church with them, and the debates that we used to have with the Democrats were over mainstream things. We talked about tax policy and environmental policy. But what's happened is you've seen radical candidates, people who are so far, so extreme, that they have made socialism the new left of the Democratic Party, and ultra-liberalism is now the moderate wing of the Democratic Party. And that's scary, that Bernie Sanders has come in and he has put on the sweater of Democratic Party politics, and he has stretched it so much that every other candidate from here forth evermore, whoever tries to put that sweater on, is going to have to try to fill it because it's been stretched. And that's what concerns me. When you look at his platform and you look how Elizabeth Warren has migrated in the direction of him, and you look at Joe Biden, who used to be viewed as a moderate on many issues and has walked back so many of his moderate positions in an effort to keep up with Bernie Sanders. You see things like free health care for all, free child care for all, free pre-K for all, free wireless internet for all, free housing for all, free jobs for all, enlarged entitlement, enlarged welfare state. It's always free, but here's the problem. There's nothing limiting about that. There's no limiting principle in the issues that they're choosing to run on. Everything is about growing government bigger and bigger. You see, what's happening now is the debate is about how big we can make the government. And the government's basically a gun, folks. And it shouldn't matter who the president is, because the government's not supposed to be that invasive in our the federal government is not supposed to be that involved in our daily lives. But because we have made it so powerful, and Republicans have been guilty of this too, but because we have made the federal government so important, because we have made it so involved in our daily lives that it does matter who the president is, and we see people who have no limiting principles, like the ones that you find in our Constitution that constrain the growth of government. You see no limiting principles in what the government can be to all people when you look at the other side. And so I want to give a shout out to President Trump, who, for every one regulation that has been passed by his administration, I think he had an order out there that you rescind, at least two, I believe, Leslie, is that correct? Two. So, because we want a net reduction in those regulations that are affecting people's daily lives. And so, as the Attorney General of South Carolina and as the Attorney General of their respective states, we have all committed ourselves as a group of soldiers in the last redoubt to defend our republic from the tyranny of those who want to take our government the way of the socialist. And socialism is on a very slippery plane because it slides right into communism, it slides into fascism, it slides into the very type of fundamental beliefs that the Nazis had. It was a socialist government. And I'm not comparing them to those types of dictators, but their philosophy is the kind of philosophy that it runs contrary to what the founders and the framers of our Constitution envisioned for our republic. And as attorneys general, we are duty bound to support our president and fighting the philosophical views being espoused by this ultra left-wing and socialist party.
Well said. Well said. Well said. Any thoughts, General Rutledge, on socialist Bernie Sanders?
Oh, I've got plenty.
You got 3 hours?
But even with my Arkansas accent, we're not going to have enough time.
They can understand you.
I know they can understand me, but and I don't know if we want to go the next question or just relay off Alan's question. I'm happy to do either, but with regard to Bernie Sanders, I will say that Senator Sanders, freedom is not free. We have had brave American men and women die on our soil and foreign soil to defend our freedoms. And so to think that everything that he and Senator Warren and everyone on that stage tonight is wanting to give away, what they're really giving away is our American freedoms. And we've got to stand up against it.
Well said. Well said. Well said. General Wilson, late last year, and this is great credit to the RIGO Association, after losing all 3 of the AG races, all 3 they lost.
The other side.
Yes,
Yeah.
they lost all 3 of them. The Democrat Attorney General Association announced a litmus test for candidates to receive the group's backing. Listen to this litmus test. Unfettered access to abortion rights. Now, a lot of Democrat presidential candidates have echoed DAGA's litmus test rhetoric, promising limitless abortion, including third trimester abortions. The former South Bend mayor said that there's no room in the Democrat Party for pro-life individuals. As the Democrat Party becomes increasingly more hostile toward the pro-life movement, is the Democrats' position becoming more radical than middle America?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at back to that enlarged sweater metaphor. I mean, the sweater has been stretched, and it was stretched over a year ago by the governor of Virginia. You know, the debate used to be between people who were pro-choice and pro-life. We talked about life of the mother. We talked about rape and incest exceptions. We talked about viability within trimesters. Although I have a very strong position, a pro-life position, we could have reasonable disagreements with our friends on the other side of the aisle. Now the debate's no longer about those things. The debate is now over, are we going to make the baby, after it is delivered and survives the abortion, are we going to resuscitate it, make it comfortable, so that we can then have a conversation on whether or not we're going to kill it? It's to when we're going to commit infanticide. That is where the debate has been moved to. And that basically goes hand in glove with everything that I just talked about how one party seems to be creeping further and further and further and further away from all reason and from all sanity. And it is something that it concerns me. And what you're doing is you're seeing, again, you're seeing Democratic presidential candidates who may have always been pro-choice, but you could have a reasonable conversation. Y'all remember the Hyde Amendment, which barred federal funding for abortions. You know, Vice President Biden has now backed off of that because he's seeking to appeal to the farthest extremist views of his party. Our Republican Party is a big tent party. Not everybody in our party is going to agree with every other Republican. Not everybody in our party always agrees with me, and I don't always agree with him, but we are a big tent, and we want that conversation. I myself personally am committed to defending the lives of the unborn. That is a conversation I'm willing to have. Thank you. I'm not going to demonize people who have a difference of opinion as to, although I think they're wrong, and I will debate them vigorously on it. We can have that conversation over, the mother's rights versus the right of a child to live, and we can have that balancing argument. But one argument we can never have is an argument on when to commit infanticide, and that is what the left is having right now, and we can't be a party to that in this country.
Thank you. General Carr, any thoughts on this radical pro-abortion position of the Democrats?
Well, I think the thing, and it's great, let me just say too, Charlie, it's great to be in South Carolina because I've been spending my summers here since I was a junior up in Isle of Palm. So it's kind of like a second home, so it's great to be here. What I think is important is what Alan said at the beginning, whether it's the issue of abortion or whether it's the issue of regulation or the issue of the role of government in people's lives. There is a stark difference between the candidates on the left and President Trump. And oftentimes we would have the debate in the Republican Party or others say, oh, there's not a dime's worth of difference between us and the other side. Well, there is now. Because I think it's important to go back to what Alan said, too. There is a slippery slope when you start espousing socialist principles. There is no freedom of religion. There is no freedom of the press. There is no freedom of speech. There is no right to assemble. There is no right to bear arms. There's no right to a fair, open, and public trial. And that's where this conversation is going. And that's dangerous. And that should really terrify folks. But if you want the incentive to get out and support President Trump versus the candidates on the other side, that's it. And I think folks need to go back and look at history. And what does socialism truly mean? And I think that that's where we are. Unfortunately, I know my grandparents would be just mystified by the conversation that we're having, and I know my parents are. But that's where we are in this country right now, and I think it's a dangerous situation.
Agreed. General Wilson, last month, 21 Republican attorneys general filed a first-of-its-kind friend of the Senate letter. I know you were a leader on that, as the others on this panel, regarding the impeachment of President Trump.
He was a great leader on it.
Thank you.
In the letter, you and your colleagues argued impeachment should never be a partisan weapon and warned that it sets a dangerous historical precedent. Now, if a Democrat, heaven forbid, wins the presidency in November, will Republicans impeach?
No. Well, first off, one of the examples that we have all used, and my two colleagues here were leaders on that letter, and they were very important for us to have on that letter, and I want to thank y'all for joining and helping us talk about this at the national level. But one of the things we need to remember is that the very things that Donald Trump was accused of doing, Vice President Biden did, Barack Obama did. You remember in 2012 when he was running for re-election and he's having an off conversation with Dmitry Medvedev on a hot mic. He asked for flexibility because this is the last election he'll ever have to answer to the general public for. And then after the election, then we can have that conversation on missile defense system along Russia's border. I mean, basically, he's asking for something of value, a quid pro quo that would benefit him personally in his re-election efforts. You know, Joe Biden, we've all heard the Ukraine Burisma controversy with his son, Hunter Biden. No sense rehashing that. But the point is that when you're going to impeach someone because they might enjoy a benefit from something, then every single member of Congress, including Adam Schiff, who's benefiting mightily, if you look at his campaign war chest from when he took over this impeachment investigation, has stood to benefit. And so I think it's a very slippery slope. The founders were very careful in how they crafted the mechanism for removing the executive in our Constitution. That is not something they wanted to be easy to do. This is the closest thing to a coup that you can find in the Constitution or in our historical jurisprudence. And so they were cautious about it, and they didn't want the executive to become a puppet or a ward of the legislative branch. And the arguments that the members of the House were making, which is purely along partisan lines, I might add, purely partisan lines, was that would have done just that, would have made the President of the United States a ward of Congress. I'll be the first to say, any future president, Republican or Democrat, the last thing we should be reaching into to our constitutional bag of tools is the tool of impeachment unless absolutely necessary. The public has a right to vote on their president. Presidents will sometimes effectuate bad government. Sometimes they will make bad decisions. But the answer to addressing those can't always be impeachment. Obviously, a high crime or misdemeanor, treason, would be among those things that we would have to look hard at. But what happened with this past impeachment was really the weaponizing of the Constitution to effectuate a bitter party's agenda to remove a president who was duly elected, and they're still not over the results of that 2016 election.
Which I think is why the other side got so upset about the letter, the friend of the Senate letter that was sent in by the Republican AGs, because we came back at this with actual legal theory. Whereas the other side, it was all about politics. Now, I know you can't take politics out of politics, but that's what this is from day one, from the night President Trump won. It's just been, the other side's been incredulous and has done everything they possibly can to get the guy out of office. Well, go beat him. Or maybe you don't think you can beat him. And so that's why you got to do this. But that's why that was so critically important. And we know folks in the Senate that were grateful that were holding that letter saying, here, this is what the rule of law says. and that's what we're supposed to be about.
And going back to a point you just reminded me of is that, you know, as the Democratic Party trends left and left, and the national leaders of the Democratic Party trend left and left, they are having trouble maintaining a reasonable position on certain issues. Nancy Pelosi, again, trying to fill that stretched sweater, once said that it would not be appropriate to go forward with an impeachment on partisan lines. She said that, I'm old enough to remember 6 months ago when she said that. and just like Joe Biden, I'm old enough to remember when he said he was against federal taxpayer-funded abortions. I'm old enough to remember that. And now, every single reasonable position that every major Democratic leader at the national level has had, they have abandoned to appease and appeal to the very loud minority of screamers. And I shouldn't say minority, because I'm sad to say I think people are starting to buy in to the Bernie burn. And I'm afraid for that. But even people who used to have reasonable positions are abandoning those for drastic and radical views.
Boy, isn't this a good discussion? Now, General Rutledge, we have Mayor Bloomberg in town. I think he's trying to improve his debate performance from last time, which I don't think would be hard to do. And you might know this, but he's personally funded nearly 20 liberal mercenaries, attorneys. And I have a hard time believing this, but it apparently is true. There are 11 Democratic Attorney General's offices to push an extreme environmental agenda. Do you believe that someone who is running for president should be allowed to use this legally ambiguous pathway to fund a personal agenda?
Well, thank you so much for that question. And even though I've already spoken, I do want to say it's great to be in South Carolina, as always. My first trip here may have been when I was much younger, but I do recall in 2008, I was counsel to former Governor Mike Huckabee's presidential campaign. And so it's fun to be back in South Carolina amidst all the presidential excitement, albeit on the wrong side of the aisle. But to answer your question, can a presidential candidate essentially use his or her personal wealth to not only win the election, but to impact and to pay for these assistant attorneys general across the country? You're absolutely right. What we've seen from Mayor Mike Bloomberg, what he has done, and before he was a presidential candidate, he put in close to $6 million into New York University so that way they could have fellows who are hired by my Democratic colleagues. Not one environmental fellow is hired by a Republican Attorney General, but rather 11 of my Democratic colleagues have hired these individuals who are, again, fellows that are, and that is a scholar term, fellow, not a gentleman of South Carolina or Arkansas or Georgia, but a scholarly fellow and an attorney general who is not accountable to the taxpayers of that state, not accountable to the taxpayers of New Mexico or Massachusetts or Illinois or Washington, D.C., and where all these places where they have basically hired guns through Mike Bloomberg who have come in to fight specifically against President Donald Trump's agenda. Not only are they fighting the environmental cases, they are also fighting the immigration cases. These are people that have been hired through Mike Bloomberg's money to go out and undo the work of the people of America.
Wow. Any thoughts, General Carr, on this topic?
Can you imagine if a wealthy conservative had done this? The Koch brothers. Can you imagine if President Trump had done that? Again, people would be going bananas. It's not ethical, it's not right to have an outside group funding an activist agenda. The role we play in upholding the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution and laws of our states matter. And to have outside groups funding activist political agendas through the Attorney General's office is not right.
And quite frankly, they couldn't pass the Green New Deal in Congress. And so what are they trying to do? They're trying to, yet again, as the Democratic narrative, go around Congress and to railroad Congress and to push it through the states by these hired guns, again, all paid for by Mike Bloomberg's pocket. Isn't it funny that the Democrats want to stand on stage tonight, and they've stood on every stage that they could get on, and tell us how the wealthy are bad people? Yet, who has the most billionaires and millionaires on the stage? It's going to be the Democratic Party tonight, and particularly Mike Bloomberg. So how dare they preach at us about, and why is capitalism bad? Capitalism is an American value. We want to be successful in America. And so I find it just astounding that they are trying to, again, inroad Congress because they couldn't get the Green New Deal passed, and they're wanting to undo the good regulations. And Alan, it wasn't 2-to-1. For every one regulation that went in, President Trump has actually taken out 26 regulations, fighting for the American businesses.
Wow.
That's right.
Wow.
Under President Trump's administration, we have the lowest African American unemployment rate. We have an incredible unemployment rate. We've had more women enter the economy and have jobs. Under this president's administration, America is thriving. America is working. Moms and dads are able to take care of their children in safer neighborhoods and to go to jobs. And so that's why we're here today. That's why we're in South Carolina talking about these important issues as we go into tonight's Democratic presidential debate.
Any thoughts, by the way, on Mayor Bloomberg's wealth, using it to, some would say, buy an election?
Well, we're going to find out whether or not you can, in fact, buy an election, whether it's here in South Carolina or next Tuesday, Super Tuesday, March 3rd, my home state of Arkansas. We will have our primary elections. There's primaries all across the United States. He has dumped so much money into it, yet has made only one debate. We will see his performance tonight if he does better, but it's going to demonstrate whether or not someone can simply buy an election. And again, the irony that all of these people are asking Americans to put aside our American values, to turn us into a socialist, then communist country that will fail, and to set all that aside while they are in fact wealthy and trying to buy an election and to reshape the threads of America.
Now, you've referenced this, if I could ask this question. A lot of talk about the Green New Deal, but there doesn't seem to be much desire in Congress to pass it. If a Democrat is elected president in November, again, heaven forbid, do you believe the next president will take a page out of the Obama playbook, using his or her pen and phone to advance a failed legislative agenda via executive orders and agency rulemaking?
Well, quite frankly, I hope not. We saw under President Obama where he, as you said, I'll use my pen, and executive order on top of executive order going around Congress. And that's why the attorneys general of all of these states were so important, whether it was the Waters of the U.S. rule, the so-called Clean Power Plan, the critical habitat, all of these regulations that we saw through the Obama administration, we filed suit against. The Department of Labor's overtime rule, which would have had a devastating impact on small business owners across America. All of these things we had to file suit against as Republican attorneys general. And oftentimes we were actually able to reach across the aisle and have Democratic colleagues because they too recognized that their own president was out of line and had not adhered to the rule of law. So I hope that we do not have a Democratic president who will go beyond the scope of his or her powers. But if they do, I can assure you the three of us and our colleagues will keep them in line.
I've seen no evidence from the people I'm listening to right now that suggests to me that they're not going to try to do the exact same thing. I think it's pretty evident what their intentions are.
Yeah. Well, and I think we see too nationally, one of the things that Leslie had mentioned and is worth repeating, what can't be done in Congress is now folks are turning to their state attorney general to file lawsuits and that sort of thing with the weaponizing of the state AG's office. And I was chief of staff to our senator from Georgia, Johnny Isakson, for years. And what you are seeing is more and more that is happening. Look, our job is to uphold the law, the laws that are duly passed by our legislature, signed by our governors. What's passed in Congress is a whole separate set of facts. But if the law needs to change, there's a process for that. You go to Congress. It may not be easy, but that's what you do. And in our states, you go to our legislatures. But to ask what you can't get done through the legislature to come to a state AG is getting outside the lane. And I think that, too, is a dangerous situation that we're seeing nationally.
Well said. General Carr, I've got a question for you, if you don't mind. Now, the last time a debate was held in South Carolina, Justice Scalia had just passed away, and buzz quickly turned to who might replace him on the Supreme Court. Now, we've had some deafening silence, haven't we, from the Democrats?
We sure have.
Deafening. Do you have any thoughts here on what would happen relative to the appointment to the highest court in case of a Supreme Court vacancy in 2020? Why do you think Democrat presidential candidates have been silent on who they nominate? What type of litmus test do you think the Democrats have for the Supreme Court nominees?
That is a great question, and the silence is deafening. You know, whether it's the Supreme Court or any federal judicial position, you know, this matters. These are lifetime appointments. You need to make sure that that folks have the right intellect and temperament and philosophy. You know, President Trump, when he was running, I look back in May of 2016, he started his short list. And he kept adding to it as the fall went on, and has since he's been in office as well. So you could see who he was thinking about putting on the Supreme Court. We don't know. So I think what we've got to do is we've got to look at what each candidate may have said or done to maybe get an idea for who they would put on the bench. So we know that Bernie and Biden have said that there's going to be a pro-choice litmus test or a pro-abortion litmus test. And we got to presume Pete Buttigieg is going to do the same thing, because he said there's not room in the Democratic Party for anybody that's pro-life. You know, Bernie Sanders is an avowed socialist. So you have to presume he's looking for folks that align with that philosophy. Or maybe he will look to somebody he apparently thinks very highly of in Fidel Castro. You know, a guy that absolutely dismissed the rule of law, jailed those that disagreed with him, but apparently they had an outstanding literacy program. Yeah. Biden was there for the 8 years during the Obama administration, so you've got an idea of the philosophy of some of the judges that were put forth during those 8 years. Elizabeth Warren, we don't know, but I got a sneaking suspicion she's not going to care if they aren't very truthful on their background check or on their application, right? And that Bloomberg was Republican, a Republican businessman, and then he was a Democrat, and then he may have been a Republican mayor, and now he's trying to chase the socialist train. But the bottom line is this: these appointments matter, and we need to know who is going to be put on the bench. And so the silence is absolutely deafening and should worry all of us.
You know, along those lines, many of you may not know this, but if you could talk about this, General Wilson, the farm team, and I'm just so proud to see what Republican attorney generals, if you can talk about the impact that President Trump has had on the federal judiciary.
Oh, listen, this is something we're very proud of. And I want to go back to your point a minute ago. You're right. President Trump, when he was candidate Trump, released a list. I don't remember how many, but it was several dozen candidates for the high office of a district or appellate court judge and even Supreme Court. And he says, these are the lists that I'm going to choose from. And so when you're voting for president, you're not just voting for a president. You're voting for all the people they're going to appoint to lifetime appointments at different levels of the judiciary. Right. And so, I mean, I applaud President Trump because he was courageous enough to say, hey, these are all the dozens of people that I'm going to bring with me into the judiciary. You vote on them as well. But like you said, deafening silence on the other side. So, I mean, I'm very grateful that the president did that. Many of the names that you saw on that list came from the state AG's offices. The state attorneys general, Republican attorneys general have populated, I believe, about 26 federal judgeships. I think there were about 12 at the appellate court level and 14 at the district court level. Some of these were solicitors general. They were appellate attorneys in various offices, chief deputies in various offices, deputy AGs in respective offices. And a lot of these judges, most of these judges that were appointed are friends of ours, people that we've worked with. And one of the things that I liked about some of these people, who right now I'm thinking of a few, these aren't people who have a political agenda that they want to push in the judiciary. These are people who want to call balls and strikes. Listen, there may come a time when I advocate a position and they may call me out at the plate because they're applying the Constitution, the black letter law of the Constitution, or the rule of law. And again, that's what we want. We don't want someone's hands on the scales of justice. What we want is someone to apply the Constitution fairly without any partisan objective. And I can tell you for the members of the previous members of the Attorney General staff who are now sit on the federal bench, these are the kinds of men and women that I believe and that I know will uphold those values.
And if I may just jump in on that for a moment. In 2016, when President Trump was running, I was often asked why I was so supportive of President Trump, because I was the only elected official in Arkansas, and now we are a deep red state now, but I was the only elected official in Arkansas to go to the convention that year as a Trump delegate. And people kept asking me, Leslie, why are you supporting Donald Trump so much? And I told them, I got 2 words, Supreme Court. And we have seen how much it matters to have the President of the United States make those appointments, those nominations, as my colleagues have touched on, not just at the Supreme Court, but up and down the judiciary. Also want to go back on one more thing on Mike Bloomberg, because I haven't forgot about him. We can't forget about him.
In your crawl.
So, last week, I believe it was, that we learned that the mayor, in his infinite wisdom, thought he would teach the rest of us, that he could easily teach the rest of America how to be a farmer. Now, I realize that in South Carolina,
What's your husband do?
this is an agriculture state, but in full disclosure, I'm married to a row crop farmer. And I know exactly how difficult it is, how much science and technology. And so I think we need to keep in mind exactly how out of touch Mayor Mike Bloomberg, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders, all of these people are, but particularly Mayor Mike Bloomberg and all of his money cannot erase his ignorance, it cannot erase his arrogance, and it cannot teach him the value of hard work that American farmers are, and they are the true conservationists in this country. So if you care about planet Earth, support farmers. Thank you.
And didn't I hear on his ad, he said he navigated New York through 9/11? I thought that was Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah. I am old enough to remember that it was Rudy.
Yeah, I am too. I remember that.
Now, don't we have some talented folks on the stage? I must say.
By the way, I will say this, going back to Mayor Bloomberg, I trust all of you. As an elected statewide official, I trust all of you to make the decision on whether or not you want to drink a 16-ounce beverage or a 24-ounce beverage, sugar, diet, I don't care. I trust you. And I think that you'll make the best decision. That is the most galling things about him that has not gotten out of my craw in the last 5 years, that he actually tried to outlaw anything over 16 ounces because he thought it was the role of government to protect people from themselves.
But you could still buy 2 8-ounces or 3, right?
Yeah, 2 12 ounces.
But Alan, to that point, and this is what we have heard time and again over the last several months from these Democratic presidential candidates, and what we've seen even from the arrogance of some of our own. We know better for you than you know for you. Mm-hmm. And we believe as Americans that we know we're the best place for our children to get an education. The government shouldn't tell us where our kids should go to school or how they should be educated. We know the best thing for our families and how to protect ourselves. And it's time that we push government out and to tell these individuals who are going to be standing on stage tonight here in South Carolina that we don't want their socialist agenda, that we want the America that we grew up with, and we want to make it and keep it great.
Right. Now, before we open that up for questions, just one final comment from each of you. The hashtag on this, Twitter hashtag, is Lawless Liberals. So any thoughts on our hashtag for this event today?
I have a lot of thoughts on our hashtag for today. Just to kind of surmise, when you talk about lawless liberals, I don't want to go into ad hominem attacks at people that disagree with me. I look at their actions more than I look at their general philosophical views. But as the Democratic Party drifts more and more to the left, I'm seeing more and more of a disregard for the rule of law, and that is something that concerns me. I have taken positions that, by the way, have gotten me in hot water with members of my own party because I had to apply the rule of law. I'm seeing a Democratic Party and a leftist party, and I want to distinguish between leftists and liberals because leftists want to shut down debate. They want to cancel people out of culture. They want to target you for microaggressions. These are people that are really out of the mainstream, but they have gotten to a point to where they want to advocate for the type of government where Congress can pass ambiguous laws that they can then allow unelected bureaucrats to enforce arbitrarily. And basically ruling through administrative fiat as opposed to the people's elected representatives. And oftentimes, they don't even want Congress to pass the laws, as Leslie pointed to a little earlier. They want to circumvent the legislative process when they can't. That's what they did with the Clean Power Plan when they couldn't pass cap and trade. They go to nameless, faceless bureaucrats who don't answer to anybody, who stay long beyond administrations, and they enforce rules arbitrarily. And that to me is lawless. And back to my opening statement, the Constitution is basically a limiting document. It has limiting principles. It limits power. It limits the ability for government to do things to states and do things to individuals. And my entire philosophical view on jurisprudence and the rule of law is what I'm doing, does it enlarge the scope and size of government? Does it enlarge the invasive nature of government into an individual's life, or does it pull it back? And at the end of the day, you're going to see people on the far left who are ignoring that. They're going to be lawless in their attempt because they're not even going to go through the legislative process. They're going to do it with a phone and a pen, and that is very scary. And like was said earlier, the person who right now is arguably, not arguably, is the front runner and arguably will be the nominee for the Democratic Party is not even a Democrat. He's a socialist, and he is going to ignore our Constitution, and he's going to do cram downs on Americans, and it's going to change this country forever if we don't wake up and fight back.
Well said. General Rhodes?
Well, thank you. And thank you again for hosting today's conversation and moderating this discussion among the attorneys general about this election and what's at stake. Every morning, including this morning before I flew over, I look at my 19-month-old daughter, and I think about what sort of state and what sort of America I want to leave for her. And that's what each of us have to dig down deep and to talk to our friends and neighbors about this election, because that is exactly what is at stake. When we look at the issues that we've talked about today, whether it's environmental policies or something as important as the pro-life movement that should be rampant across the country, the fact that we are even having to have discussions where there is not room in the Democratic Party for someone to be pro-life. There should be a lot of room on both sides of the aisle for pro-life. Because I know when I held my daughter for the first time, I knew exactly how much God loves us.
Oh.
And as Americans, we have to value life. We have to value our constitutional freedoms, whether it's freedom of religion, because if they will attack the cake baker in Colorado or the T-shirt maker in Kentucky, they will attack us anywhere for our freedom of religion. America is thriving, as I mentioned. More Americans are working than ever before, and they're taking care of their families. Under President Trump, he said, we are closed for overregulation, and we are open for business in the United States of America. And every single one of us needs to get out and talk to our friends to make certain that this president is reelected and that we adhere to the rule of law in this country, so that way we can leave this country better than we found it, and so our children, grandchildren, and generations to come can have as many opportunities as they want.
Hey, well said.
Well said.
Carr?
That's a tough act to follow. But nature abhors a vacuum. And when Congress gets less and less done, and again, I work as chief of staff to a senator, so this is not disparaging anybody who's in Washington right now, but when Congress gets less and less done, that vacuum gets filled by the federal executive branch through executive order and through regulation. We heard about it in the Obama administration. That's how they were going to do it. And so you see pushback from the states. You saw Republican attorneys general led by these two great attorneys general pushing back on federal overreach. That was the principle that we pushed back on. In the last 3 years, we have seen twice as many lawsuits filed as we filed in the 8 years of the Obama administration. The principle we used was the rule of law and pushing back on federal overreach. The principle that's been used by our colleagues is we hate Trump. That's a difference. To what Alan just said, the rule of law matters. And there is a stark difference between the candidates that are running for president. I suggest, again, at the end of the day, when you're looking at the other side and when you see they're going so far, and I think Alan did a great job between liberal and leftist to see how far left they're going, the rule of law just does not matter, but it should, it must, because that's what this country is based on. So we're going to do our job. We thank you for what you do to represent your state and to support folks like Alan. And we'll keep fighting.
Yeah.
That's right.
Terrific. Yeah. Questions?
I'm with Live 5 News here in Charleston. Thank you so much for taking questions from us. I'd like to know what, Attorney General Wilson, what is your message to voters who are going to be voting in the Democratic primary on Saturday?
So I was doing an interview earlier today, and I said the same thing. I think this is the first state that's really going to tell us the direction that the Democratic Party is going to go. The first 3 election contests were involved caucus states. Those caucus states is a cumbersome process for picking a nominee in either party. Usually, far fewer people turn out for it because it's so involved and it's so time-consuming, as opposed to stopping off to vote after on your way to work, on your way home in the evening. So you get a lower voter turnout. The state of New Hampshire, wonderful state, but it's not as probably a diverse Democratic Party up there. Here, you're going to have a lot more African-American engagement in the Democratic Party in South Carolina. So I think you can get a better microcosm of what's to come in the Democratic primaries across the country. So to my friends in the Democratic Party in South Carolina, I would say that your vote, which you do this coming Saturday, is going to set the tone. And basically, it's the last time, the last springboard that these candidates get before they jump into Super Tuesday 3 days later. And so what's going to happen Saturday could really be the linchpin of this entire election season. So I'm asking my Democratic friends, I don't really know of a good candidate that y'all have, if I'm being honest with myself, but I do know this. Do everything you can to pull your party back to the center, to try to stay in the reasonable lane, because right now, you have a plurality of people that I understand in the last polling data that I've seen in South Carolina on the Democratic Party that are okay with the socialist being president and who think socialism can beat Donald Trump. And that is we fought wars over this. And so to my Democratic friends, I ask you, plain and simple, to reject socialism.
I just have one more follow-up question. With South Carolina having open primaries, will you be voting in the primary, and why or why not?
I will not be voting in the primary on Saturday because, well, for a couple of reasons. I'm not going to vote in a Democratic presidential preference primary, and I also plan to be with my friends, the Republican Attorney General Association in Washington, D.C., so I'll be flying up that day.
Ann Emerson, ABC News 4 here in Charleston. And this question I could open really to any of our esteemed panel here, but I wanted to find out basically your thoughts on the polarization right now in our politics. We're certainly seeing rhetoric on both sides that are elevated. Now, look, this isn't going to go on forever. We have a few more months of this, basically, and then we have to come back together. Where do you see us coming back together, and is that something that's going to be priority, no matter which way we go?
Well, I'll be happy to jump in and talk about that. I think it's time that as Americans, we come and reason together. Many of us remember a time when we would see officials in our nation's capital go at one another on the Senate floor and then be able to work it out. Unfortunately, with the invent of the social media, people feel very comfortable saying the most hateful and vitriolic things at one another without fact-checking. And it's important that we as Americans recognize that while we may disagree philosophically, we are all Americans, and that we should all be working toward the same goals of ensuring our freedoms, our constitutional rights, and again, leaving America in a better place than what we found it, and making and keeping America great.
I think politics has always been polarizing. If you go back and you read the history of the first contested presidential election back in the late 1790s, and going forward, I mean, even George Washington was called unethical and a man of no integrity by the writers of that day. People in the public square, in the arena, have always been attacked. But I think what makes this generation, this era in our nation's history a little different is, as she said, the advent of social media, because it has made it so easy for people to, it's democratized hate. Is what it's done. It's made it so much easier to hate. Back in the day, you almost had to look the person you were talking about in the eye. You could write things about him, but you had to see him. Here, people that you'll never see, that you will never know, and that will never know you, can say the most hateful, evil, horrible things about you. And so what I would do is not just about, there's always going to be vitriolic and debate by elected officials at all levels of government. I guess my statement would be to the American people is that you have that little phone in your pocket or your laptop or whatever you communicate with. Next time you're about to post something, understand that if what you're posting is just designed to make you feel better and it's just really attacking somebody, you're not really moving the ball forward. And so we've got to tap down the rhetoric in social media. That's where I think the polarization's coming from, because it's just so easy to hate nameless, faceless people that we'll never see.
Employ the Abraham Lincoln theory. Type it, hit save, don't hit send.
I think Abraham Lincoln actually said that.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
It's the modern Abraham Lincoln theory.
All right, is that for past questions? Then thanks all for coming, and thank you.
Well, there was one question that was not asked for the media, and I am so glad, because I was terrified because I didn't have an answer. And the question was, did Attorney General Chris Carr and I coordinate our outfits this morning before we got here? And this was just dumb luck, wasn't it?
I am so glad Alan wore his Georgia Bulldog tie today. That was
Okay, boys.
Does anyone in the audience want to ask a question?
Any questions? Sure, yeah. There you go.
Charlie, I'll let you.
Sure, yeah, go. Sure.
I think a lot of things we're talking about here can really be traced back to one area. And I believe that we are raising generations of young folks now that do not understand all that you know about the formulation of our beautiful documents, our Constitution, et cetera. And they are now don't have benefit of this knowledge, not taught it in school, so somebody can tell them anything and they believe it. What can we do to alter this and force civic and government instructions back into our elementary right on through high school?
I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about a year or two ago, maybe closer to 2 years ago, and it was talking about millennials. And I know there's another generation. Was it Gen Z is behind millennials, if I recall, Gen Z. But this was talking about the millennial generation. And I don't remember the exact percentages, but I think it was 70% at that time of millennials had an okay or favorable view of socialism, and had a near 45 to 50% negative view of capitalism. And again, I might be butchering the stats, so I'll have to go back and look at the article. But when the question was asked about free markets, it flipped. They had a favorable view of free markets, and then when you labeled it government-run markets, they had a less favorable view. And so what I think it is I think fundamentally, and this is me being hopeful, maybe naive, but hopeful, that it's not that socialism is now preferred as an ideology. It's that the word doesn't have the meaning to many younger people that it has to us. And so instead of using the word socialism, we probably need to call it what it is. And we need to talk in plain terms, because socialism to many people under the age of 35 means, helping the downtrodden, equalizing inequality, taking care of people. It's a soft, feel-good word. It's not something that I associate with fascism, communism, Nazism, totalitarianism. They associate it with taking care of people. And so I think fundamentally most Americans don't want to live in the USSR. They want to live in Nazi Germany or in Italy in 1935. They want to live in a free and prosperous nation. They just don't have the education to know what the words actually mean. That's my belief anyway. Education.
Oh, I'm a big history buff, so I'm with you 1,000%. In fact, I just had a conversation last night with a young man that's pushing for civics to be re-injected into the Georgia curriculum. I don't know how it works in South Carolina, but I presume it's somewhat similar. Local school boards and the State School Board of Education and curriculum, but we've got to go back and make sure that we are understanding history and civics and put it back in the curriculum. One of the things I've said is history to me, our history class ended at World War II. I never got anything further than that. So everything I know about Korea and the civil rights movement, I had to learn on my own. Well, what I understand now from talking to history teachers is you maybe get to Reagan. Well, that goes back to the whole socialism conversation, is if you only get to that far and nobody knows anything about 9/11. And so, folks that were born 18 years ago were born a year or two after 9/11. Wow. So it's a historical fact, just like for us, anything that happened in the Revolutionary War was type thing. So I think I'm a big believer. I think we do need to focus on history and civics being put back in our classes. I've got a 15-year-old daughter, and the amount of time that they have not spent on history and civics to me is just it's unfortunate.
Very good. Yes. Huh? Yeah, sure.
Is that Cindy or
Cindy?
both those?
Okay, yeah.
Friday night, the Charleston County Republican Party celebrated Black History Month, and our featured guest honored speaker was Armstrong Williams. And this is my question. Do you perceive that there is coming soon a point of convergence where the low unemployment rate and the prosperity under Trump in the African American community all of a sudden begins to also meet the values, the pro-life values in the Black community that they're living out and celebrating every Sunday in their lives, and that we might be on the precipice of some kind of synergistic move in the African American community when they wake up every day and realize not only is work better under Republican values, but the sanctity of the lives of all our children are better in this country.
Cindy, Tim Scott, I think, said recently that he believed that there would be a 50% increase in the black vote for President Trump in this coming election. And I don't know if it'll be 50%, but I definitely believe it's going to be a larger percent than it was last time. I do believe there are incremental moves to communicating and connecting with the black community. Anecdotally, as I talk to pastors in black churches around the state of South Carolina, I could say at least probably close to half a dozen I've spoke to in the last 6 months are less and less comfortable being associated and affiliated with the Democratic Party than they used to be because of some of the things coming out of this presidential election cycle. So I think one of the benefits of this presidential election cycle is that the values that are so ingrained in the African American community, values that we all support and agree with, I think is going to make it untenable for many of them to remain devout followers of the Democratic Party in the future. That is my hope anyway, but that's what the pastors are telling me.
Is there a question over here? Yeah, sure. Yes, please.
National Committee.
The attorney generals in the different states do about all this sanctuary city protection for illegals.
Well, this is something, Cindy, thanks for that question. I've actually had the opportunity to sit down with President Trump in a roundtable discussion that he often does these and talk about the sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, quite frankly. It's not simply a city here or a city there. And it's important that we recognize, and as much as all of us and all of you, I'm certain, are supportive of states' rights. However, when it comes to immigration and who is coming in to this country, it is important that that is a federal issue. And it's important that we know exactly who's coming into this country. Because if one city, whether it be Los Angeles or Chicago or an entire state of California, determines itself to be a sanctuary city or a sanctuary state, that impacts all of America. Those individuals do not stay within that city or within that state. Right. They move about the country. It becomes little islands for criminal activity for these individuals and cartels to move drugs, to move human beings through. We have seen such an increase in our drug cartels and through human trafficking, illegal fentanyl, all of this coming up through our southern border. And so it is upon us and the federal government to work collaboratively to shut down these sanctuary cities, that America is the greatest sanctuary the world has ever known, and we have got to protect it. And by protecting it, we must adhere and follow the rule of law because we are a country of laws. We want immigrants, but we want them to come here in the light of day and not through the dead of night. And we want them to come legally and to go through the proper process. We all still look at the Statue of Liberty as the beacon of hope. And we want people across the world to. When they are suffering in ways that we can't imagine suffering, we want them to say, I want to come to the United States of America. But we also want them to come and be productive citizens and to engage in our communities. So with that, we are hand in hand. Many of us are with this administration, working very closely with them and law enforcement. Our law enforcement officers don't get enough thank yous for what they do to protect us every single day.
Yeah.
So,
We can't have an open border and a robust social safety net for the whole world at the same time. We just can't. We cannot afford it. And what I thought was interesting, and a point of personal privilege here, about 10 or so years ago, a member of Congress yelled at the president in a joint session when the president said illegal aliens will not be afforded the ability to have taxpayer-funded health care. And several months ago, at one of the Democratic debates, when asked, would you be for supporting taxpayer-funded health care to illegal aliens who are here through an open border, every member on that stage, every Democrat raised their hand. So somebody was a prophet.
Wow. Wow.
And we have a sanctuary city law in Georgia too, so that defines what what criteria you have to meet to be a sanctuary city, and if you meet that criteria, you can get certain funding from the state withheld, usually Department of Transportation, some community grants and that sort of thing. The one thing I see too is a lot of times folks want to say that they're a sanctuary city for political purposes in the Democratic Party, but there's an actual definition in state law, and then we uphold that law.
One last question and then we'll wrap it up.
Gosh, we have two wonderful ladies here asking a question. Can we switch? How about two fast ones? That'd be okay? Yeah. Maybe two quick ones? Yeah.
First of all, I want to applaud you all for fighting the good fight. I do believe that the Democrat agenda poses an existential threat to this nation and as a consequence the world if they are able to implement that. I am admittedly a damn Yankee, although a lifelong Republican.
I married one of y'all, by the way, New Jersey.
Some of us are good. But I came down here and I'm a proud South Carolinian now. There is one area where I believe, and I have fought the fight up there in the north, where the Democrats or liberals, whatever you want to call them, outdo us. That is regarding the uncomfortable issue of domestic violence. If you look at the statistics in red states, particularly South Carolina, Arkansas, it's abominable. And it goes to the rule of law. As we were talking, it goes to the sanctity of life, and it goes to the judiciary. And when perpetrators are able to get away with doing what they do on a regular basis with just a slap on the wrist, and if it's a wealthy person paying a few $1,000s, they can find that under the couch cushions. They're not held accountable. And that is why we have this continued crisis going on here, which affects multiple generations. What can we do as Republicans to change that? We would bring more people into the fold if we could, I'm not talking about the whole Me Too insanity thing. The whole thing.
And I can answer that really fast because I think we're going to take one more quick one before we adjourn, and I want to get you, and I can talk to you offline more in depth. We're already doing it. Republicans and Democrats working together about 6 years ago reformed our state's domestic violence laws. And who do you think people look to on the enforcement of laws and vigorous prosecution without letting people out with no bail when they commit violent crimes against anybody, whether it's a woman or anyone? It's the Republican Party. So I think the Republican Party is on high ground on this issue. Obviously, in our state, we've worked very well with our Democratic colleagues on reforming domestic violence laws. I could let my colleagues speak about their states, but we're doing it right now. The things that you're talking about.
And thank you for bringing that issue up. It's so important, not just to women, but to men. And too many people don't realize that men are also victims of domestic violence. In my home state of Arkansas, we passed a law and distributed information so that way every single victim of domestic violence knows what his or her resources are, whether it's a shelter or somewhere, to get out of that situation and to provide them that hope that God's got a better plan for them and to remind them of that. We have seen too many lives lost, and again, it's generational, as you talk about. And one of my childhood friends, who I played with every single day after school, and she was taller than me, and so she protected me from the bigger boys on campus, my big brother and the rest of them, when we would play after school. I wish I had been there to protect her when her husband took her life before he took his own. And so domestic violence, we must raise awareness. And I think as Republicans, we need to ensure that the values of our platform are shared, because it is the value of life, valuing life. And that's what, when these individuals strike and hurt another person, they don't value life. They don't value that person's life. They don't value their own life, and they don't value their child's life. And so we need to make sure that our values are being shared. So, thank you.
One last question.
I am a product of immigration from Canada to the U.S. And I passed through the system in the 70s, and I have to go past a long X-ray to see if I did not have any tuberculosis. And also I have my step finger, and they have to check on me if I did not kill anybody. I was a head nurse of obstetric and gynecology. But anyway, I have to sign a paper. I did not come here to take anybody's job, and my husband had to sign. He was taking care of me because I got married with an American, not a Yankee, but American, in South Carolina. And what I would like to see people when they are on TV, and some people say we all immigrants. Yes, many of us and our great-grandparents arrived in Ellis Island, and they have go through their health thing, and if they're not in good condition, they have going back home, and the rest was treating. And then many young people in school don't even know what Ellis Island is. And maybe, I know they know about the South to come to Mexico and all that, it's marvelous. But nobody taught how everybody arrived here. Is the way that maybe the school and told all the teacher to tell these young children where my own daughter went to New York, and she was very happy to go take with the little 12 years old and to go to Ellis Island and find my husband's father in the list on the board. Then when they arrive and all that, that is why maybe it's important we talk about not just the South, also people who are from other countries who come there, and it's what is missing. When we all immigrants, yes, we are immigrants, but we have to go through the system, and I think this is missing from South and North.
I agree. I found my grandfather, the manifest of the ship he came on in 1916, and a picture of the ship. So I agree with you 1,000%.
Hey. Oh, well. Well, if I can have one final round of applause for our outstanding panel here.
Applaud, y'all.